Hello, this is Brian.
And this is Stephanie.
Welcome to the making and the remaking of a codependent mind. We're going to talk about relationship boundaries today, which is going to expand on the subject where we started talking about it, and we talked about it a little bit to some extent in an earlier boundaries episode we did in this season.
Before we get to that, though, I just want to mention kind of briefly a follow-up on the jealousy episode, which was last week, because I think we gave the feeling of jealousy a little short shrift. So we talked about jealousy being a fear of loss, but we didn't really talk about how it feels, because it doesn't always feel like a fear of loss.
Right. It doesn't seem to always come through as fear. When I've reflected on how it feels, it's a little more than fear. Sometimes it's kind of like a hurt. There's a pain to it.
I agree. So it can still be rooted in this sense of loss, but it doesn't really physically hit as fear all the time. Sometimes, but I mean, sometimes it could feel more like anger or shame. Rejection. The way it hits your body isn't necessarily, I'm afraid of losing. And it certainly doesn't often hit your mind that way because, for instance, I have felt jealous of things that happened in the past. It's over. There's no immediate threat of losing you, say, or losing my partner in those situations. But there still is the possibility of loss.
Because there's a lot of different things you can lose. And if we go back to the me, you, and us, the three elements that make up the relationship, you can be losing something from any of these three. So the classic is just like, I fear losing you, so that's kind of the jealousy. Like, you might leave and I might lose you. But there's also, I could lose myself.
Lose a certain sense of yourself, of who you are, who you were, who you are to another person.
And then, of course, the us being losing something that our relationship had that seemed to make the relationship special, something that we had that others didn't.
The us loss being, it could be this loss of status of the relationship, like you're saying, that the relationship was meaningful in some way, and now you've lost that. So that's the connection to the relationship boundaries. The relationship is the us of the me, you, us equation. And relationship boundaries are going to come into play when thinking about what the status of that relationship is. So if a relationship, not just a person, can be lost, then that relationship has to have some definition around it. And that's where relationship boundaries come in.
What is this relationship? How is it bounded? Kind of like when we talked about the personal boundaries being, I'm me, you're you, my physical body is mine. So what does define this us, this relationship?
Any grouping of people, there's going to be that impetus to define that community, to put boundaries around it. So in the literal case of a country, there's geographic boundaries, but there's also lots of history or documents or discussions around who is part of that country, who gets to be part of that country, who doesn't get to be that part of that country, and what that means if you are part of that country, and what it means if you're not part of that country. Similarly, with political communities or artistic communities or families, for sure, there's very often definition around who's in the family, who's not in the family. And again, that involves kind of cultural traditions and rituals and names and legal definitions.
I can think about my own family. There's certain things that...
This is your immediate family?
Yeah, the family I grew up in. So my parents and my brother, what I came to expect from my family, the types of things we did together, the way we behaved with each other and things like that. So one of them being just, we weren't a family that really debated things. We talked about this once before where yours sort of was, mine wasn't. We didn't argue about things. We just sort of got along.
Was that articulated?
Well, no, none of these things were really articulated except for maybe like the traditions. We had holiday traditions and things like that. So we discussed those and how important those were, and to kind of an excessive extent to sometimes where like we had to make sure to do these 20 things every Christmas or something.
You found it excessive.
I mean, eventually I did.
But that was a way, presumably of your parents, of constructing a boundary around your family. Like, this is what it means to be a part of our family.
Yes.
Is that we do these things. We have these rituals over Christmas. And it's important that everyone conforms to these boundaries. Everyone participates in a certain way.
And for most of my childhood, those things were fine. I mean, they made me feel somewhat safe and connected. I mean, there were some negative ones too, like my mom saying, "This is our family's luck," and things like that. Like,
well, so this is what we're going to talk about: is this how are these relationship boundaries constructed, and in what ways can they be productive of the relationship and nourishing, and in which ways can they sometimes be destructive towards the people in the relationship or in the context, and also towards the relationship itself. Because for pair bonding, there is an expectation in our culture that the pair is set aside, that it is defined in some way, that it is kind of special or unique in terms of its status amongst all the different us's that we participate in. So we all have a lot of us's, right? If I say we, I can mean me and my fellow country people. I can mean me and my fellow community members. I can me and my immediate family, me and my extended family, me and you, me and my children. So there's
the company you work for.
The company, there's
right.
a lot of us's that are out there, but certainly in our cultural traditions and for many, or if not most, the pair bond has this kind of unique status, and defining what that is and the boundaries around that pair bond. Those boundaries can be a relationship tool. And like all the other relationship tools, they can be used productively or they can be used destructively.
And then going back to this relationship work, the work that this tool does do, it goes to strengthen the partnership. That's what it can do a really great job at when used productively, is to give that sense of team, that sense of partnership.
So this is, the boundaries help us understand this is what the partnership will look like. This is what we both can expect from each other and from the partnership.
So it becomes sort of an agreement. I mean,
those agreements are important, whether they're explicit or implicit. We should be entering in relationships, like we talked about, say, in the entitlement episode, with expectations that they will enrich our lives. The relationships are things we choose, not things that we're stuck into and have to survive the best we can.
Well, unless you're like I was.
Yes, but we were trying to move away from that. Seeing as relationships as something we choose, and in which case they're a partnership, and partnerships should produce benefits for everyone involved.
Yeah, what are some of these benefits?
We want, and a lot of us expect a lot in this moment in time from our romantic, intimate partnerships. There's kind of a long list of things that we can potentially get. For instance, emotional intimacy and connection, sexual satisfaction,
shared financial resources, companionship, doing things together,
sense of safety, sense of security,
co-parenting.
Yeah, that's one that a lot of people expect from their romantic pair. Support and assistance, passion, excitement.
That we're special somehow, that we matter, that we stand out.
Yep, self-esteem from the relationship, confidence.
I mean, that's a lot of things, and you're not necessarily going to get that all from one person in one relationship. But I know it's tempting to want that, of course.
I mean, we're pretty close.
I know, right? But it's difficult to get that, for people to get all of these things from one relationship.
Yes. And I said, we're pretty close in getting on the list, but we're not the sole source. It's not like you're my only source for all these things, but our relationship is a source of all these things.
Yes. And depending on what your other resources are, like when we start in a relationship, like in our case, you had more friends than I did. So you were more well-resourced with companionship already, and I wasn't. So it was tempting for me to put more eggs in the companionship basket for us. And that's going to be the case for a lot of people, finding one thing a little more important than the other person does for this specific relationship.
For instance, the co-parenting, some people will go into romantic pair bonds, and the most important thing that they want out of that relationship is a strong co-parenting situation, where some people, for instance, ones who don't want to be parents, that's not going to be a priority that they get out of their romantic relationships. It's a good co-parent or a good financial partner. That might be something to prioritize. They might prioritize sexual satisfaction, for instance, or
safety or something.
And so not only can you prioritize things differently, sometimes they can be even in conflict with each other. So, for instance, someone's need for safety and security could be in conflict with someone's desire or need for sexual variety in order to have sexual satisfaction. So that might not be a partnership that works. That might not be a relationship. The me and the you in that case might not translate into an us partnership that makes sense for both of those people, because it cannot be defined in such a way that both people get their needs met. And so it's not sustainable.
So that's where relationship boundaries and actually discussing that as a unit is important, because now we're coming together and we're asking, what does this relationship need, so that the two of us can get our needs and our expectations met.
And we want to define and structure those boundaries so that the relationship is set up to provide as many of those things for as long as possible. So we're looking for, again, stable, long-lasting relationships that are nurturing and fulfilling. And if you use the boundaries tool wrong, you could off the top set up a relationship structure where things could quickly or over time become very unstable.
Yeah, just overwhelm the system, ask too much of it, put too much pressure on it.
Well, that's one way.
Right, that's one way.
Is
right.
to overwhelm the system. And you have an example.
Yeah, I actually have an example of that from a friendship that we talked about on this podcast, where it started off really great. I mean, it started off with as the type of relationship that I enjoy now, where I felt safe, I felt connected, I felt kind of a sense of pride in that friendship, that this was unique and it's special, and it satisfies a lot of needs. And initially, the relationship was kind of well resourced too. The two of us, we were high school friends. We went to different colleges. We had other friends. But eventually, once we both got out of college, we moved in together, and our world started to shrink, and we started to rely a little too much on the safety that we got out of it. And it became difficult for both of us to relate to other people outside the relationship. We both started to feel anxious when interacting with other people. And then every time we came home to each other, it was like, it was just a satisfying relief that now we can just relax. We were conscious of this is the thing. We were conscious that it was starting to get this way, that both of us were starting to feel anxious outside of our friendship. And we tried to do things about it. We would try to go to social functions together and talk to other people, but both of us would wind up feeling anxious and self-conscious when talking to other people and nervous. And then we'd come back together at the function and just express to each other, wow, what a relief. Whew. Like, that was difficult. And then just tell each other how great it was that we at least had each other to return to, kind of like we were like falling back, like this was some kind of battle. This
circle the wagons.
Yeah,
everyone else was a threat, and you were in a bunker. This kind of bunker mentality.
Yes, a bunker. I think that's a really good image. That's kind of what it felt like. Going out on the front lines, and we're battling social anxiety, and then we're retreating into our bunker, and it just kept getting worse and worse. And
this isn't an example of deliberately or kind of intentionally drawing a constrictive boundary, but just over time, that's de facto what happened.
Like I said, we were conscious of this, and we were trying to not have that be the case, and we didn't want it. And so neither one of us had these kind of like rules for each other. You can't go out and hang out with other people or anything like that. It's just, that's the way it became.
So as years go by, the world gets smaller and smaller. Mm-hmm. Your individual worlds, and then the world of the relationship gets smaller and smaller, and you're in this bunker together.
Yeah, it just became much, much too restrictive. And eventually the environment just deteriorated. It was as though we got everything we could out of the relationship, and it just fell apart.
And you parted ways knowing that at that point, the relationship was holding you back. It wasn't helping you thrive.
Right, exactly.
And that's an example of too constrictive of a boundary, where there's this sense of it's us and everything else side of us is a threat, including other people, other experiences, other environments. They're all threats, potential threats, which is true. There are potential threats outside of relationship, but the other side of that is there are also important resources that exist outside the relationship. And I think the bunker analogy kind of makes that clear. Like, you need other things to come from outside the relationship in order to help the relationship survive and the people in it survive. I mean, the one obvious example is financial, at this point, financial resources. I mean, at least you had a job and were able to bring finances into that relationship. Probably would have deteriorated much more quickly if that wasn't the case. But that's true for other sources of companionship, other sources of excitement, other sources of other new experiences. Those all are resources for the relationship.
We needed other perspectives. That was actually something that we acknowledged quite a bit too, is just that, just having other perspective, other people we could talk to, run our emotions by, things like that would have been extremely valuable.
Yes. So, I mean, other people being the main resource that's available out there for us, that we're not trying to get everything we need from one relationship. Provide insight, as you say, provide support, or a source of confidence, or a source of intimacy, or a source of excitement. Again, not just for the people in the relationship, but for the relationship itself.
So like I said, initially that friendship was a source of pride and a source of confidence. But eventually, because it wasn't fed by these external experiences, it started to cause shame instead. And I felt a great deal of shame in retreating into this bunker. And so did he. And then that pride was just dried up. And then I felt like we were just two losers that hung out together and didn't have any other friends. So at that point, we had to go our separate ways and pretty much end the relationship.
Yeah. So in that case, the us was very clearly defined. It didn't suffer from a lack of definition, the relationship. I mean, you were roommates, you were financial partners, you were bandmates, you were best friends. There was lots of ways that was defined. The problem there was that the relationship boundaries were almost exclusively a threat response. There was almost no ability to access resources. So, and then, the me, the you, the us all suffer in that case. So when we're thinking about using it productively, we want to think of both of those sides of the coin, the threat side and the resources side. I think often with relationship boundaries, there is more of a focus on threat, which is understandable because as a species, we're often more focused on threats than we are on opportunities. And certainly on the personal level, we talked about protecting and respecting, and the problem that you had and that many people with codependent behaviors and habits have, this inability to protect yourself by respecting your own boundaries and demanding that respect from other people. But when we get to the relationship level, I think it's particularly important to move beyond just protection to this other part, which is the respecting of the relationship, meaning understanding what the relationship needs to sustain itself and also to grow and thrive. So trying to find this balance between protecting the relationship from threats, and there may be some threats to the relationship, but it's equally as important, maybe if not more important, to make sure that the relationship is adequately resourced.
Which is exactly the image I get when I think about that story with that friend, because that's exactly what happened, is that the resources, the external resources, dried up and the us suffered as a result.
And one of the reasons I think it's really important to talk about resources and not just threats is because of the issue that we discussed in the boundaries episode when we talked about relationship boundaries, is that people can sometimes confuse rules with boundaries, and then they're not the same thing. Boundaries have to do with this negotiation between responding to threats and taking advantage of opportunities and resources, not about imposing rules. Right,
which is exactly what the situation was in this relationship that we talked about in the previous episode when we were talking about jealousy, my relationship with Jay. When we entered this open relationship period, these rules were not relationship boundaries.
In that they were not about threats or resources.
They were not about threats and resources. Instead, they were about control. So again, things like you need to check in by 11 o'clock, kind of the 11 o'clock curfew. You need to text every time.
If you're on a date.
Yeah, if you're on a date, you need to check in by 11 o'clock. You need to respond to any texts that I send you. You can't spend your money on anyone else other than me.
Because these were not legitimate threats to the relationship.
Right. They weren't threats to the relationship. Yeah.
If you were out past 11 on a date and didn't text her, that wasn't a threat to the relationship.
Because, I mean, for one thing, she broke these rules herself all the time.
And the relationship didn't disintegrate.
Yeah, and it did. Yeah, right. So it was just about me not doing these things.
So this sounds like more of the same. We've heard a lot about this relationship where it's her needs, wants, desires were always to be prioritized. And the rules, which were disguised potentially as boundaries, were just a mechanism for her to enforce that priority. The rules were about her and how you were to treat her, not about the us.
Yes, because there was no us. There was no defined us. There was just a her. And I actually found this email that I had written back at the time that Jay had proposed opening the relationship. So this email was kind of just me processing out loud what it would mean to the relationship if we were to open it up. So I talked about the things that I was providing, the fact that I was providing all the domestic labor and all the financial resources and basically doing all the caretaking in the relationship. And it was basically a sexless relationship also. So I was kind of going through these different areas. So I was trying to figure out what kind of partnership we would have left, like what exactly our relationship would be. Because we didn't have sex anymore, but if she was getting sex outside the relationship, then I was no longer her sexual partner. We weren't domestic partners because I did all of the domestic work. I provided all the finances, so we weren't financial partners. So what partnership did we have? And especially now, if we were to now open this up. So what was left? What was this relationship? If we weren't sexual partners, we weren't domestic partners, we weren't financial partners, what were we? What partnership was it? Exactly. What was the us is essentially what I was trying to get at in these thoughts.
How do you define that relationship if it doesn't involve all of these things that we traditionally use to define a romantic, intimate relationship?
Right. And so I sent this to her even. I wasn't planning on, but I did. And I got a very upsetting response. And then I just put the whole thing out of my mind and just plowed ahead.
Part of the problem, as you articulated, is when you opened your marriage, there was already not much of a marriage to begin with.
Yes.
So, I mean, how did you think of that us to begin with, even before you opened it up? Because as you said, there weren't all these levels of partnership that we all expect from a relationship.
I made the really weak attempts, I remember at the time, to like try to define what makes a couple. And one of them was that we have to sleep in the same bed, even though it was a miserable experience. I've talked about this before, where I couldn't move, or she would pound the bed and get angry. So I developed this problem to where I couldn't sleep solidly anymore. And there were 2 other beds in the house, 2 other bedrooms that were not being used that I could have gone and slept in. But for some reason, I convinced myself that I had to sleep in that bed. Like it was necessary to define that relationship. If I were to move into the other room, then again, kind of like this, then what are we?
So that's what the us meant for the two of you, is that you slept in the same bed.
Slept in the same bed, even though we went to sleep at different times.
Yeah,
and
so
had
that's the
completely
thing that
different
made
patterns.
the two of you special, is that you slept in the same bed together.
Yes. Kind of like what I was talking about before too, like, oh, we watched TV together or something, like,
yes,
yay.
but you watch TV with other people, presumably, sometimes. But that was your special thing.
Yes.
You slept in the same. And I wonder too if that was part of the reason why you were so quick to combine finances with both R and J, to try to make it seem like a legit. I mean, you didn't really know how to define relationships because you were not bringing, for instance, your own needs and wants into them. So you just kind of glommed onto these. Well, what do other people say make a relationship? Mm-hmm. Oh, you share the same bed. You share finances. So that's what I'm going to do. And then I'm doing what you do in a relationship.
Yes, and I think I used my parents as a model, and not that I knew anything about their relationship, but that seemed to be the way they were set up. They were still sleeping in the same bed at that point. And
well, yeah. So if we don't choose to define our relationships, they're going to be defined by the larger culture. If you don't intentionally think about and construct with your partner the boundaries of your relationship, you're going to inherit a bunch of boundaries and definitions from your family, from your culture, from your religion. And there are a lot of problems with inherited relationship boundaries. Historically, they've been very restrictive, especially for women, because they've been often explicitly about controlling women. So this is an example kind of on a cultural scale of what Jay was doing to you on an individual scale. We're using relationship boundaries to restrict and control women and men to some extent. But, in patriarchal societies, which are almost all of them, it was about controlling women's bodies, controlling their labor, controlling their time, controlling their thoughts even, disguised as pretending to be protected against threats. But that's a bigger conversation. Fortunately, certainly in our cultures and in many cultures, that's been changing pretty dramatically over time, where the relationship boundaries of a pair bond have become more expansive. So, for instance, we can think women working outside the home, where none of the financial boundaries around a pair bond that has become more expansive, where both people are able to, and in fact, almost expected or need to now go out and get financial resources to resource the relationship. And then obviously opposite sex companionship is part of a lot of people's lives, even when they're in a pair bond. So boundaries have now expanded in order to include members of the opposite sex. Probably the last area is the sexual arena, where there's still a lot of cultural baggage that's attached to sexual exclusivity. We're inheriting a lot of boundaries as to what each person can do with other people, especially sexually.
Well, in my experience of polyamory, we were talking about this a little bit in the last episode, was that the idea of that was kind of a way to have this conversation. What does this mean? What does sexual exclusivity mean? How can we expand our thinking on what it means to relate to other people and to have relationships with multiple people that may include sexual relationships?
Yeah, I mean, I have a kind of a problem with the word polyamory. I think it's a little weird, because it literally means multiple loves. And isn't that the situation we're all in?
That's true, yeah.
We are all polyamorous, and then we all love more than one person. But nevertheless, I do appreciate the discourse that comes out of the ethical non-monogamy culture, where there does seem to be honest attempts at figuring out what relationship boundaries around sex and love could look like that are more authentic, more fulfilling than the ones that we just all inherited. These scripts that we all inherited. And there's a relationship/sex columnist podcaster that I don't think we brought up, Dan Savage, who's been talking about this stuff for decades now. And one of the points he makes is that the gay community, of which he is a part, because they didn't fit into these traditional relationship boundaries, and their relationships that they have were not even legally not allowed to be a part of for a long time, these traditional relationships boundaries, marriage being a very explicit legal boundary. They had to make up their own. So the default in a gay relationship or gay pair bond is not necessarily sexual monogamy. They don't go into pair bonds assuming that what's going to happen is the strict sexual exclusivity, that the default is to discuss, negotiate, figure out what works for that relationship. Where for heterosexuals, most of us just go in without even thinking about it. We just assume this is going to be the boundary, as if it's some sort of universal law that if you're in a romantic pair, what that means is that you are sexually exclusive. And you both have miraculously the same idea of what sexually exclusive means.
And that's not always going to be the case, obviously.
And Dan Savage is the one that coined the term that people might have heard of, monogamish, to describe one of these negotiated relationship boundaries. You have your primary sexual partner, which is your romantic partner, which is your life partner. But if you go to a party and have some fun with some other guy sexually, it's no big deal. So that's monogamish. You're in a committed relationship, and you occasionally have some brief sexual experiences with other people. So this could be an example of a sexual relationship boundary that again works for that particular relationship and those particular people. It keeps going back to this me, you, and us, the three entities, and you're making choices of all three. You make a choice about what you want for yourself. You make a choice of the person you want to share your life with. And then the two of you make the choice of a relationship that makes sense. And again, you could choose a person that you are sexually attracted to, that you are romantically attracted to. And it could be that there's not an us there. You can't construct an us out of the two pieces of the you and me. And that's sad and unfortunate, but it's important to recognize when that's the case. Or you could find a way to set up a relationship boundary, a sexual relationship boundary, and other types of boundaries and construct an us that makes sense for both of you. So you might find someone you're sexually attracted to, you're romantically attracted to, and they're also sexually romantically attracted to you. And then you both need to choose an us that works for the two of you. And you could think of a situation, especially with sexual boundaries, where there might be some conflict in terms of how do you both get, say, sexual satisfaction from the same us. For instance, someone might have a sexual kink or fetish, and the other person is not interested at all in participating with that kink. So there's still choices involved there. It's not just like, oh, we have to break up, or you can't do that kink, or you must do that kink, right? It could be, okay, well, we have a sexual relationship, but in terms of that particular aspect of it, the kink, that person goes elsewhere and has certain maybe bounded relationships outside of the us in order to find that kind of sexual satisfaction.
That was actually a really common thing I saw when I was in this non-monogamy group, was that people were there for that specific reason, where just one of them or both of them had a kink or a fetish of some kind that didn't line up with each other. So they were in a committed relationship, but they went to this group so that they could meet people that were into that particular thing. And then that's what they would do. They would just find and get satisfaction from that one particular thing with other people. And that was the extent of the open relationship.
So the question would be not what am I allowed to do, what are you allowed to do, but what type of relationship boundary around sex needs to happen for this relationship so that we are both getting sexual satisfaction that we need. That needs to be discussed. What is the boundary that is needed here for the two of us and for this particular relationship?
And this is going to start with something that I struggled with, which is self-knowledge, and to be vulnerable with these things and to feel entitled to actually discuss what this is, that we have these preferences, because we all do have to have preferences. We all have things that sexually excite us or don't. And we need to be willing to have those conversations and not just close our eyes and hope that the universe will present us with a perfect match, because otherwise it could potentially blow up. And like it did for me in those situations where I went into those previous relationships with no sense of entitlement and prepared to just do whatever was expected of me. And for me, that included just trying to satisfy other people, performing. And then when I didn't perform well, oops, disastrous sexual experience.
It blows up for a lot of people. Sex is a big issue for a lot of couples. Esther Perel has a quote about infidelity, which she writes quite a bit about, where she says cheating is universally forbidden, but universally practiced. And I'm not going to speak to the morality of cheating, but more so to the point that she's making is that there are good reasons why it's universally forbidden, because it can be very destructive and hurtful, but there's also reasons why it's universally practiced. And in part because we inherit all these relationship boundaries that we don't talk about and we don't understand. And yet sexual satisfaction is an important resource for individuals and couples. And if it's depleted in a relationship and unavailable in a person's life, that's a problem.
Which is exactly why these discussions need to be about both people's needs. And both people owe it to themselves and to each other and to the relationship to come into that prepared to have that discussion and to be honest about their feelings and what they consider threats, legitimate threats. What threats do they see to the us and what they want from the us?
And what kind of resources are needed for the relationship to be a success for them? And, that can be problematic for people like yourself, as you said, who are unfamiliar with understanding their feelings and evaluating threats and resources. Particularly evaluating threats can be a challenge, I think. For instance, just because I'm anxious, say, if my partner has lunch with a work colleague, or I'm anxious because my partner, well, say you say I'm anxious if you go to a strip club, doesn't mean that there's an actual threat to the relationship. I mean, this is what we talked about last episode in jealousy. Just because I feel bad doesn't mean there's an actual threat to the relationship. And this is, I think it can help us understand the difference between a rule and a boundary. Say I'm anxious because you're going to lunch regularly with a work colleague who's a woman. That doesn't mean it's an actual threat to the relationship. That feeling could be coming from my own past, from something a friend told me. So it's not appropriate for me to make a rule for you to follow so that I don't have to feel that feeling. What would be appropriate is for me to talk about that feeling of threat with you and for the two of us to decide whether there is an actual threat. So maybe this is a woman who has made repeated sexual advances towards you. So we might, as a couple, decide one of our relationship boundaries is neither of us spend regular time alone with people who have made sexual advances, with people who don't respect our relationship. That's very different than a rule, me saying, that makes me uncomfortable that you're having lunch with that person. You're not allowed to have lunch with that person.
Right. Just starting from that place as opposed
That's
to...
a rule. A
Yes.
boundary is the two of us deciding, like, neither of us want to be around people who don't respect our relationship, which if you're making sexual advances towards someone who is unavailable sexually, that's disrespectful. And we would decide together, no, that's not something that we do. That person is a potential threat to the relationship. That's a relationship boundary that is about addressing what we both see as a legitimate threat to the relationship versus a rule where I'm trying to control your behavior so I don't feel a certain way. Because relationship boundaries are not about managing difficult emotions. Difficult emotions are not to be managed away. They're to be felt and understood. And in fact, you might have relationship boundaries that bring up difficult emotions. So if we sit down and discuss the fact that this work colleague is not a threat, there's no reason to think she's a threat, and it's just maybe some lingering trauma I have, and this is an important work relationship for you, so it's an important work relationship for us as a couple. This person's an important resource for your work life, your financial life. So I need to just deal with and manage my feelings of anxiety or jealousy myself.
And we could find ways to help you do that with emotional co-regulation. I could tell you about what the conversations are or something. There could be things that we can do to help with that.
But again, for our relationship to have the resources that it needs, in this case, professional resources, financial resources, that boundary has to include you being able to have lunch, interact with people from the opposite sex. It just does.
Yeah. Otherwise, we're entering this territory like this friendship.
You can help me deal with my feelings, but the boundary is about making sure the relationship has what it needs. The boundaries are not about making sure that the people in the relationship never feel bad. They're not an emotional management tool.
Right. So this reminds me again of Jay's jealous-like behaviors. We talked about these rules that were meant to control the resources that she felt like she was entitled to, not the fear of losing me or the fear of losing our relationship, but just the fear of losing that control.
So it was managing her anxiety and need for control, not about strengthening and protecting your relationship. Again, boundaries being what the relationship needs in order to be a stable, long-lasting source of all the things we listed, or as many of the things we listed for as long as it can. So back to the strip club example. So maybe I have some uncomfortable feelings about you going to a strip club, which I actually think I would. But those aren't the most, me having uncomfortable feelings is not the most important part of that conversation. That's not the focus of the conversation. The focus of the conversation is what you going to the strip club means for the relationship. Now, let's say you're going because it's your best friend's bachelor party, and it's a group of friends that's really important to you, played a big part in your life, friends who have been and continue to be a source of emotional support, a source of insight, a source of safety for you. If they're that for you, they're that for us. So those relationships are important. And if the strip club is part of that, you going to the strip club is actually resourcing our relationship because it's cultivating relationships with people around our relationship that are going to be an ongoing source of support and insight and companionship to us as well as to you and to me. So that's a very different scenario than if, say, you're going every week and spending lots of money by yourself at a strip club. Like what that means to the relationship is much different, even though it's going to a strip club. So again, it's not like a rule. You can't go to strip clubs. It's about what boundaries make sense, what boundaries bring resources to the relationship, or what boundaries protect against legitimate and clear and present threats. The saying, no man is an island. No relationship is an island. We can generate a lot of the things on the list between the two of us. So companionship and sexual satisfaction and emotional intimacy and financial resources. There's a lot of work that we do to generate those things within our relationship. But it's hard to do just the two of us. It's really helpful to have outside support.
Especially in the long run, too. You know, all of these things can use ongoing support from other resources. And that's why you continue to have these discussions. I mean, in one of ours that we have, like we mentioned previously, is that we're monogamous.
Sexually
monogamous, right? Because there's other ways of.
Well, we don't consider ourselves emotionally monogamous.
Right.
For instance, we both have important, loving, close relationships with other people of both sexes.
And we've had some good conversations about that. That feels valuable. It feels helpful. It feels like it strengthens us to have those kind of relationships. But the sexual monogamy is something that we continue to discuss on a regular basis, just like we would any other relationship boundary, because these things may change because each of us are separate people with needs and feelings that may change over time, that will change over time.
Absolutely. Even the boundaries around sex can change as you come to have new, increased understandings of what the us is and what the you are and how that me and how we changed and have changed.
Yeah, which is exactly why we revisit this topic. And that is the important thing.
As we're discussing, using the tool productively means intentionally and authentically discussing the relationship boundaries, whether they're sexual, emotional, financial, familial, that this particular relationship needs at this particular time in order to either address clear and present threats. So there may be cause for circling the wagon, for instance, maybe against your in-laws or something,
Mm-hmm.
or in order to provide the relationship with the resources that it needs. And this is to go back to the analogies we said at the beginning of the episode. This is what a country needs to do. This is what a community do. This is what a family needs to do. They need to both protect against external threats, but also bring in the resources the family, the community, the country needs in order to survive and thrive. Most countries, communities, families cannot generate all of the resources they need to be a thriving community internally. There has to be interaction with the communities outside. So the same thing with the unit of two. There are some threats, but importantly, there are resources that need to be brought into the relationship.
So then it's very important on how that is done. Is it done productively or destructively? And then the destructive methods are going to be those ones that are more about controlling behavior. So controlling the other, one person controlling the other person's behaviors, or trying to manage their difficult emotions by things like rules. And it may work in the moment. You may get this temporary relief from these anxieties that you have. But in the long run, it's going to eventually just deplete the relationship.
And also destructive is as if they're not talked about, if they're not decided on, and then they're just violated because the people within the relationship are not getting what they need and not talking about why that is or what could change in order to make that happen. So me, you, us, all of those entities need to be looked after. And relationship boundaries are one way that the us is taken care of.
So we hope you remember to prioritize the us just as much as you would prioritize me and you in the relationship.
And thanks again for listening. Thanks to all of you who follow, like, review, helps other people find the podcast and the book, which we appreciate. And we hope you join us in a couple weeks.